Hi, and welcome to this second Pro-C tutorial, which will focus on the extra options available in Expert mode. Expert mode is enabled via the button under the metering section, and slides the panel back to reveal extra sidechain parameters. Before we look at these, however, notice that Expert mode has also changed some of the knobs in the main section. The input level, output level, and dry mix knobs all now have an extra ring around the edge labelled pan, so we can adjust the balance between left and right channels for the input signal, or for the compressed output signal. Or we can have a compressed left channel, but only dry signal on the right. Control clicking the pan rings will reset them back to the middle. The sidechain section contains another pair of gain knobs with another pair of rings around them, this time labelled mix. The sidechain is the part that monitors the incoming signal level. So if I turn these two gain controls all the way down, the signal doesn't get any quieter. In fact, it gets louder, because the signal isn't reaching the compressor's threshold anymore, and we no longer have any gain reduction. If I turn the level up instead, we see the compressor start to work harder. So turning the sidechain gain up is effectively the same as turning the threshold down by the same amount, and vice versa. The mix rings control the mix of the left and right channels sent to each detector. By default, they are both set to the middle, so both detectors are being sent an identical mono mix of both channels. If we turn on the audition button, we can listen to the sidechain instead of the main signal path. And sure enough, we hear the signal collapse to mono. This ensures that the gain reduction for both left and right channels is identical, as we can see from the gain reduction meters to the left. And this avoids altering the stereo image of the source material. I'm going to turn the mix ring down for the left channel now, but I'm actually going to hold down the Alt key while I do it, so that the right channel's mix ring also moves, but in the opposite direction. Now we can see that the gain reduction for the left and right channels is no longer the same. And we now have separate dual mono compressors instead of a single stereo compressor. We can achieve partial stereo linking by turning the mix knobs back towards the centre and feeding the detector inputs a reduced stereo image. Of course, both channels share the same compression parameters, so we can't set a higher ratio for the left channel than for the right. But we do have separate level controls for each sidechain, so we can turn the level up for the left channel and drive the compressor harder, exactly as if we had turned down the threshold by the same amount. And we can then use the pan ring for the output to compensate for the extra compression in the left channel. The MS button enables mid-side mode, which gives us a different way to approach stereo signals. We can still send a conventional stereo signal into Pro-C, and we still get a conventional stereo signal out of Pro-C. But all the processing in between takes place using mid and side versions of the signal instead of left and right. The easiest way to hear what I mean is to adjust the pan ring around the output level knob. If I turn this all the way to the left, we hear just the mid component of the signal, which is literally the left and right channels added together to make mono. And if I turn it all the way to the right, we hear just the side component of the signal. This is actually the right channel subtracted from the left channel, or in other words, the difference between the channels. And this is what you lose when you add the left and right channels together to make the mono sum. I can therefore use the pan ring to control the stereo width. Control clicking to set it halfway up gives us the same as we started with, and we can reduce the stereo width by turning it down, or increase it by turning it up. I'm going to take this a step further and turn down the gain knob for the left detector input, which as you can see is now labelled mid. Now the compressor's mid channel isn't doing anything, as we can see from the gain reduction meters, and only the side channel is being compressed. If I turn the mix ring for the side detector all the way to the right, the side detector will only be listening to the side channel. Or in other words, Pro-C is now an automatic stereo width controller. Of course, we could also do the opposite. If I turn up the mid gain and turn down the side instead, I can compress centrally panned elements of the mix without affecting anything that's panned to the sides. Now let's take a look at the sliders at the bottom. These control high-pass and low-pass filters, which again only affect the sidechain. If I set the high-pass filter up high, we still hear a full range signal, but the compressor doesn't, so the gain reduction has disappeared. Pressing the audition button allows us to tune the filters more easily. If I was processing a sibilant vocal part, I might want to set these filters to isolate the S frequencies and thereby create a de-esser effect. In this case, however, I'm just going to set the high-pass filter to about 80 Hz to stop the compressor responding excessively to the kick drum. If I turn audition off again, we hear the full range signal, but the compressor is now ignoring low bass signals and is less likely to pump audibly in time with the kick. So what about the external button? If you're using the VST2 versions, this will be greyed out for the stereo plug, and you will need to load the stereo sidechain version instead. So let's turn this on, and notice that our gain reduction has disappeared, and we see no input level on the transfer graph. This is because nothing is currently routed to the external sidechain inputs. The routing method will depend on the host you are using, so you may need to consult your manual if you're not sure how to go about it. I'm going to use a modular host to make it obvious what's going on. The black pins at the top are MIDI inputs and outputs to allow for MIDI control of the plug. Next up, we have 2 stereo pairs of inputs and 1 stereo pair of outputs. The first pair of inputs is for the signal to be processed, in this case the whole stereo mix, and the processed signal emerges from the stereo outputs. The extra pair of inputs are labelled sidechain, and with the external button turned on, these feed the compressor's detector. If I connect the same signal to both pairs of inputs, we get exactly the same results as internal mode. But if I turn off Pro-C's internal sidechain filters and patch an EQ plug before the sidechain inputs, we can create much more precise and surgical versions of the frequency-conscious compression we set up earlier. For example, I could use a low shelving EQ instead of a high-pass filter to reduce the low-frequency compression without killing it completely. Or I could boost a specific frequency in the sidechain, which is equivalent to lowering the compressor threshold for just that frequency. And we aren't limited to using EQs for the sidechain. A wide range of interesting results can be obtained by distorting the sidechain signal to clip the peaks, or by inserting other dynamics plugs such as noise gates or expanders. Or of course, we can also send the sidechain input a totally different signal. Now I am keying the compression from my voiceover with subtle ducking of only 2 to 3 dB and a gentle slow release time. Notice also that I'm using mid-side mode, and the side gain is turned all the way down, so I am only ducking the mid channel when I speak. The stereo side component is not affected at all. And in actual fact, you've been listening to this setting for the whole tutorial. Users of VST2 hosts will notice they also have mono and mono sidechain versions available. These have fewer inputs and outputs, and a slightly simpler interface without the stereo option. Here I have the mono sidechain version of the plug inserted on the bass channel. And if I turn on audition, we can hear that I have routed the kick to the external sidechain input. Now I can adjust the threshold, ratio, and release time to duck the bass in time with the kick drum. MIDI Learn works the same way for all versions of the plug. Again, the method for routing MIDI data to the plug will depend on the host you are using. You can check you have this set up correctly by enabling MIDI and making sure the MIDI indicator lights up when you move a controller. Now simply enable MIDI Learn, move a knob on the GUI, then move the hardware control you wish to link to it. Turn off MIDI Learn when you're done, and you can now set up your compression using hardware knobs instead of the mouse. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching.